The air in Waycross, Georgia, in the autumn of 1857, was thick with the scent of pine and decay, a familiar blend in the humid south. The town was small, a quiet, unremarkable stop on the trading routes, save for one establishment, the Crossroads Inn. It was an imposing two-story structure, painted a faded, melancholic blue, sitting isolated where the old post road met the winding trail to the coast. Its owner, Silas Croft, was a man of impeccable, if unsettling, manners. A widower, he ran the inn with a silent, heavy efficiency, rarely smiling, but always ensuring his guests were well fed, famously so. The current chill in the air had nothing to do with the temperature, however. It was a cold dread that had settled over Waycross following the disappearance of Mr. and Mrs. Eldridge. They were well-known cotton brokers from Savannah, travelers who had stayed at the Crossroads Inn 3 weeks prior and simply vanished without a trace, leaving behind only their empty carriage at the stables. Sheriff Thomas Vance, a weary man whose youth had been drained by the demands of a rapidly growing restless state, stood by the bar, the rough wood cool beneath his fingers. He had come to the inn not as a customer, but as an investigator, though he had nothing to show for it but a gnawing suspicion. "Mr. Croft," Sheriff Vance addressed Silas, whose back was ramrod straight as he wiped down a pewter mug until it shone. "Have you recalled anything more about the Eldridge's departure? Anything at all that seemed hurried?" Silas Croft, a tall man with unnervingly steady grey eyes and a precisely trimmed beard, paused, the scraping sound of the mug against the cloth ceasing. "Sheriff, as I told you, they paid their bill promptly after supper. Said they had an early start. They were perfectly pleasant, perfectly normal. The moon was dark, the road unlit. Perhaps they simply missed a turn on the post road." His voice was low and even, devoid of inflection. It was the calmness of a pond that hides immense, dangerous depth. Vance shook his head, looking around the nearly empty dining hall. The inn was famous for its supper, a rich, dark stew Croft called the Traveler's Comfort, served with a side of crispy, spiced meat that was always in high demand. Tonight, only a pair of merchants from Augusta sat by the fire, talking quietly and tearing chunks from a loaf of bread. "A couple doesn't simply miss a turn and abandon a new carriage, Mr. Croft, not Eldridge. He was meticulous," Vance pressed, leaning in slightly. "And his luggage? Not a single bag was taken. Just their coats and their persons." Croft placed the mug precisely on a shelf. "Well, Sheriff, people do peculiar things when they travel. Perhaps they were meeting someone. Perhaps they intended to leave without the baggage to start fresh. I am an innkeeper, not a mind reader." He finally turned, his gaze meeting Vance's. There was no hostility, only a flat, unnerving politeness. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I must see to the supper preparation. My kitchen runs on a tight schedule, and the patrons expect punctuality." Vance watched him go, noting the crispness of his linen shirt and the immaculate polish on his boots. Croft was an anomaly in this muddy, rough town, too clean, too controlled. He knew Croft's history. A former cook on a large plantation who had suddenly acquired the deed to the inn 5 years ago after its previous owner, a heavy drinker named Alistair, suddenly moved north, according to Croft. No one had heard from Alistair since. A young serving girl, Eliza, whom Vance recognized from town, approached him to clean the small table he occupied. She was pale, with wide, anxious eyes. "Sheriff Vance, sir," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire. "Yes, Eliza," Vance replied, his attention immediately fixed on her fearful expression. She dropped her gaze, wiping the table with exaggerated care. I remember something about the Eldridge's last supper. Something I didn't tell you before because, well, Mr. Croft does not like talk." Vance pulled out a chair and sat, his posture instantly tense. "Take your time, Eliza. What is it?" "The stew," she murmured, leaning closer. "The Traveler's Comfort. Mr. Eldridge, he said it was the richest he'd ever tasted, but he asked Mr. Croft what kind of meat it was. He said it was unlike any beef or pork he knew." Vance frowned. And what did Croft say? He smiled, sir. A thin, slow smile. And he said it was a special cut, procured from a local exclusive source he would not divulge. But the strangest thing, Mrs. Eldridge, she only took one bite, and then she looked sick. She pushed the bowl away. When Mr. Eldridge pressed her, she just shook her head and said, "It tastes too rich, dear. Like man meat." She was joking, of course, but her face, she wasn't laughing. Eliza finished the sentence with a visible shudder and quickly backed away, casting a nervous glance toward the swinging door of the kitchen. Vance sat back, the image of Croft's thin, slow smile and the words "man meat" echoing in the quiet dining hall. It was a macabre joke, a nervous superstition perhaps, but in the context of the Eldridges' complete disappearance and the inn's unsettling atmosphere, it was enough to solidify Vance's darkest fear. The inn was isolated, the local supplier unknown, and the owner unnervingly composed. This was not a simple case of travelers losing their way. This was a deliberate vanishing, and the trail led straight into Croft's immaculate kitchen. The terror lay not in what was unknown, but in the dreadful possibility of what was right under their noses. Vance stood up, his hand instinctively resting on the pistol holstered at his hip. He knew he had to get inside that kitchen, past the swinging door and the smell of spices, but he needed a solid reason. He needed to find what Croft's local exclusive source truly was. The stew, the highly praised, intensely flavored stew, now sat in his mind as a ghastly, silent clue. He walked past the two merchants who were now noisily enjoying their meal, oblivious to the dread hanging in the air. Vance gave Croft a final long look at the kitchen door, the wood of which seemed to hold a dark, secret warmth. If you're gripped by the cold dread of Waycross and the mystery of the Crossroads Inn, don't miss the next chapter of this chilling story. Subscribe to the channel now and hit the notification bell so you don't miss a single step in Sheriff Vance's investigation. Sheriff Vance left the Crossroads Inn, the scent of the evening's dinner clinging to his coat, a rich, savory smell that now turned his stomach. The merchant's easy chatter and the glow of the inn's lamps seemed a deceptive facade. He rode his horse, Bess, back toward the main settlement of Waycross, the autumn night chilling his resolve. He had to be methodical. An outright search of Silas Croft's kitchen without a solid warrant would be a legal and social disaster in 1857 Georgia, especially for a well-respected, if peculiar, businessman. The power of suspicion alone was not enough. Vance found Dr. Elias Finch, the town's elderly physician and occasional coroner, at his small clinic, mixing a tonic by candlelight. Finch was a pragmatic man, relying on science, not superstition. "Dr. Finch," Vance began, removing his hat, "I need your professional judgment and I need absolute discretion." Vance recounted the Eldridge's disappearance, the abandoned carriage, the rumor of the previous owner moving north suddenly, and finally, Eliza's chilling anecdote about the man-meat joke and Mrs. Eldridge's reaction. Finch carefully capped his vial and turned, his spectacles magnifying the gravity in his eyes. "Sheriff, man-meat is a phrase born of folklore and poor digestion, but combined with the vanishing and Croft's known culinary skills, it's unsettling. A specific, unfamiliar cut of meat, you say?" "Yes. Croft claims it's from a local, exclusive source. I need to know what that source is, but directly searching the inn is premature. I need proof that something illegal or unnatural is occurring before I can break down that kitchen door." Finch sat down, tapping his fingers thoughtfully on his desk. If the meat is human, or even an exotic game, its composition would be distinct from common livestock. It has unique fats, proteins, and muscle fibers. I could theoretically determine its origin. "Can you get a sample?" Vance asked. Finch shook his head. "If I go there and ask for a plate of the traveler's comfort for study, Croft will know immediately. He's not stupid. No, we need a different angle. A complaint. A genuine health concern." A plan began to form in Vance's mind, utilizing the inn's own operations. The waste, The inn serves up to 20 people a night. Where does Croft dispose of his kitchen waste and bones? It has to be nearby. It's 1857, Doctor. No modern sanitation. The old septic field likely behind the smokehouse, Finch mused. But the remnants of that stew, they're consumed, Sheriff. The bones and inedible scraps of whatever meat he uses would be the key. If he's procuring large quantities of meat, he must also be dealing with the related parts. Hides, unusable organs, larger bones. Vance looked at the doctor, a grim certainty hardening his features. If the Eldridges were used for this exclusive source, their bones must be somewhere. Too large to fully dispose of through fire without a massive blaze that would draw attention. They agreed on a nocturnal reconnaissance. Vance would return to the inn under the cover of darkness to search the immediate exterior perimeter. The smokehouse, the root cellar entrance, and the waste area. Finch would remain prepared, waiting for a sample. As the late-night fog began to roll in, Vance approached the inn on foot, leaving Bess tied a quarter-mile down the road. The inn was dark save for a single lamp in Croft's private upstairs window. The silence was unnerving. He crept around to the rear of the building, the damp grass muffling his boots. He found the waste pit first, a shallow depression covered with a wooden lid, smelling intensely of rotting vegetables and sour milk. It was a common sight. He lifted the lid, and the stench was overwhelming. He held his breath, lighting a small, shielded match. He saw common debris, but no large, discernible bones. Croft was meticulously clean, even in his disposal. Next, the smokehouse. He jiggled the padlock. Secure. Finally, the root cellar entrance. A heavy wooden hatch set flush into the ground a few yards from the kitchen wall. It was secured by a thick, rusty bolt. As Vance knelt to examine it, he noticed a faint metallic scent, sharp and acrid, mixed with the dominant aroma of deep earth and spices. He pressed his ear to the wood. Silence. He pulled a small picklock from his saddlebag kit, a necessary tool for a man who often dealt with locked doors and trunks in his line of work, and set to work on the rusty bolt. After several anxious minutes, the bolt slid open with a sharp, grating clank that sounded deafening in the stillness. Vance slowly lifted the heavy wooden door. A rush of cold, earthy air, heavy with the metallic tang, hit him. He lit his match again and carefully descended the rickety wooden steps. The cellar was small, lined with shelves holding jars of preserved vegetables, pickles, and several large salted hams. But along the far wall, covered by a heavy, stained canvas tarp, was a shape that made his blood run cold. It was clearly the form of two large wooden shipping trunks, placed side by side. They weren't the sort of trunks one uses for travel. They were heavy-duty, reinforced storage boxes, the kind used for moving cargo. And they were secured not with simple locks, but with multiple iron clamps and padlocks. Vance approached, his hand shaking slightly as he held the small match. He knelt and brought the light closer to the trunk closest to him. The metallic smell was strongest here. He noticed a dark, sticky stain on the rough wood near the base of the trunk. It looked too thick and too black to be simple wine or molasses. He pressed his ear against the trunk's cold, hard surface. Nothing. Just as he was about to try his picklock on the heavy padlocks, a sound from above froze him. The distinct creak of the kitchen door opening. Croft. Vance had only seconds. He scrambled back up the steps, pulling the heavy hatch door down as quickly and quietly as possible. He fumbled with the rusty bolt, finally managing to slide it back into place just as he heard the crunch of boots on the gravel path a few feet away. Vance flattened himself against the cold stone wall of the inn, pressing into the shadows between the root cellar and the woodpile. Silas Croft walked past, carrying a heavy, steaming bucket that was clearly kitchen waste. He walked toward the waste pit, lifted the lid, and dumped the contents with a wet, heavy thud. He stood there for a moment, silent, looking out into the foggy field, before turning slowly and walking back toward the inn. Vance did not move until the kitchen door had shut, and he heard the bolt slide home. The trunks were his proof. They were too secured, too hidden, and too large to simply hold preserved peaches. The sticky stain, the metallic scent, the eldridges vanishing. It all coalesced into one terrifying, realistic conclusion. He had to get a sample from those trunks. He carefully crept back into the fog-shrouded field, his mind racing with the horrific possibilities of what those iron clamps were holding in the darkness beneath the Crossroads Inn. The shadow has deepened, and the truth is locked away in the cold earth. If you are desperate to see what Sheriff Vance discovers next in the cellar, subscribe to the channel now. Hit the notification bell and join the search for the horrifying truth hidden beneath the Crossroads Inn. The fear in Sheriff Vance's chest was a cold, hard knot. He reached his horse and rode back to Dr. Finch's clinic, his mind replaying the sight of the reinforced trunks. He was certain Croft knew he was there, or at least suspected intrusion, given the timing of the garbage disposal. Finch listened, his face pale in the lamplight, as Vance described the root cellar, the heavy padlocks, and the disturbing stain. "Trunks, Sheriff? Secured like that?" Finch murmured. "Not for storing meat, not even cured hams. Those would be hung. That level of security suggests something inanimate, or something he wishes to keep inanimate. I need to get a sample of that dark stain, Doctor. It was dried but thick. If it's what I fear, it will yield something." Vance knew direct confrontation now was too risky. Croft was prepared. They needed a distraction, something that would draw Croft completely away from the inn and the cellar hatch. The post road, Vance decided. There's a notorious stretch of thick mud a mile west. I'll need some men I can trust implicitly, and a fabricated emergency. By mid-morning, Vance returned to Waycross, rallying 3 men. His deputy, Jeb, a reliable taciturn farmer named Guthrie, and a strong blacksmith, Ben. He instructed them on the necessity of silence and the seriousness of the errand, without disclosing the true horror. Vance then rode directly to the Crossroads Inn. He found Croft sweeping the porch with his usual unnatural precision. "Mr. Croft, a predicament," Vance announced, adopting a tone of professional urgency. "A messenger just arrived. A carriage carrying important documents from Savannah is stuck deep in the mud patch on the West Road. They need immediate assistance with ropes and manpower. It's a heavy wagon. The state needs those documents moved before the rain hits." Croft paused his sweeping, his gray eyes narrowed slightly, assessing the sheriff. "I am an innkeeper, Sheriff, not a rescue party." "I know, but you have the largest ropes and the strongest harness in the immediate area. I'm taking my deputy and 2 men, but we'll need your gear, and honestly, your strength. The state will compensate you handsomely for the trouble." Vance made the compensation sound immediate and lucrative, tapping into the innkeeper's known frugality. Croft hesitated for a calculated moment, then nodded. "Very well, Sheriff. Duty calls, I suppose. I will fetch the ropes and my heavy gloves." The ruse worked. Vance ensured Croft joined the rescue party, physically accompanying them to the fabricated site a mile away. As soon as the 5 men were out of sight and deeply engrossed in pretending to haul a phantom wagon out of the non-existent mud, a truly muddy patch being common enough to make the story plausible, Vance gave his men the signal. "Jeb, Ben, keep him occupied with that rope. Make it look necessary. Guthrie, with me. The inn." Vance and Guthrie rode hard back to the crossroads. They entered through the back, Vance immediately heading for the root cellar. "Guthrie, stand guard," Vance ordered, already working his picklock on the bolt. This time he didn't risk a slow entry. He swung the door open and dropped into the cellar. The metallic smell was stronger in the daylight that streamed in from the open hatch. Vance immediately went to the nearest trunk, pulling out a small medical syringe and a vial provided by Finch. He scraped a portion of the thick, dark residue from the wood and carefully transferred it into the vial. Now, for the locks. He had only a few minutes. He worked on the padlocks with tense, frantic movements, the friction of the metal echoing in the small space. Finally, one lock on the first trunk snapped open, then the second and the third. With a deep, shaky breath, Vance lifted the heavy, reinforced lid. The contents were not the cured meats or preserved vegetables he had prayed for. They were bundles of clothing, folded meticulously. Men's and women's coats, shirts and trousers, all finely made, clearly expensive. He recognized the distinct pattern of Mrs. Eldridge's shawl draped over the top. The Eldridges had only left their coats and their persons. Here was the rest of their worldly possessions, organized and stored like an inventory. Beneath the clothes there were financial ledgers and personal documents, bank drafts, land deeds, and personal letters belonging to the Eldridges, and beneath those, documents belonging to another couple who had vanished 2 years prior, and then Alistair, the previous owner. Croft wasn't just killing his victims, he was meticulously cataloging their existence, absorbing their history, and collecting their valuables. As Vance sifted through the documents, a shocking discovery emerged. Hidden beneath Alistair's papers was a small, leather-bound journal. It was Croft's. Vance quickly flipped to a recent entry. It was less a diary and more a detailed inventory of ingredients and yields. Entry, October 1st. Eldridge, M. Excellent specimen, good marbling. Yield, 175 lbs. Best cuts for the comfort stew. Secondary cuts for the spiced roast special, Eldridge F. Leaner, yield, 110 lbs. Less flavorful, used mostly for stock and rendered fat. Vance's stomach seized and he gagged, fighting back the immediate nausea. The stark, dispassionate language, specimen, yield, marbling, stripped the murder of humanity and replaced it with a chilling, clinical pathology. Croft was operating a slaughterhouse disguised as a reputable inn. He wasn't just disposing of bodies, he was processing and utilizing them in his famous meals. He heard Guthrie's sharp whistle from the top of the steps, a prearranged signal. Croft was returning. Vance slammed the lid shut, relocking the padlocks with shaking hands, replacing the journal and the documents exactly as he'd found them. He grabbed the vial with the dark stain and scrambled up the stairs, pulling the hatch closed and sliding the bolt home with a desperate force. He and Guthrie mounted their horses and galloped away just as they saw Croft rounding the corner near the stables. Vance felt the cold, hard weight of the vial in his pocket. It was the only proof he needed. He had seen the truth, and it was far more terrifying than any ghost story. The famed traveler's comfort stew was a feast of human suffering. Vance rode straight back to Dr. Finch's clinic, the smell of the inn and the image of the contents of the trunk permanently etched into his memory. The small vial containing the dark, dried stain was his only link to the horror he had just witnessed. Finch was waiting, the clinic illuminated by a bright, steady lamp over his examination table. Vance wasted no time recounting the successful deception, the contents of the trunks, the meticulously stored clothes and the victim's financial records, and the horrifying discovery of Croft's inventory journal. "He's not just a killer, Doctor," Vance said, placing the vial on the table. His voice was ragged. "He's a butcher, a calculated, methodical, cannibalistic butcher. The Eldridges weren't lost, they were consumed." Finch, a man accustomed to the gruesome realities of disease and sudden death, nevertheless went pale. He picked up the vial, his hands trembling slightly, then placed it under a primitive but functional microscope he had acquired from a European contact. "This residue, Sheriff," Finch said, meticulously preparing a slide. "If it's blood, its origin will tell us much. The chemical markers, the cellular structure, they are distinctive in human tissue." The room fell into a tense, agonizing silence, broken only by the scratching of Finch's instruments and the gentle sputter of the oil lamp. Vance stood, arms crossed, staring at the shadows on the wall, visualizing Croft's calm, gray eyes and his thin, slow smile. After what felt like an eternity, Finch straightened up, removing his spectacles. His face was a mask of cold revulsion. "Sheriff Vance," he began, his voice barely a whisper, "the sample is indeed blood. But more telling, I detected traces of myoglobin in the dried residue, a specific form of myoglobin that is unique to primate muscle tissue. It is not beef. It is not pig. It is not venison." Finch paused, rubbing his temples. "I will need to run a full analysis on the composition, the fat and protein structure. But based on the cellular evidence, the location of the sample and the contents of that journal, I can state, with the certainty of my profession, that this is consistent with human blood and tissue residue. The official confirmation, though expected, hit Vance like a physical blow. The town's favorite dinner was a silent funeral pyre. "We have to move tonight," Vance declared, pushing his own exhaustion aside. "He knows I was near the cellar. He might panic. He might dispose of the evidence." "Wait, Sheriff. Rash action is exactly what a man like Croft expects," Finch cautioned. "He operates on precision. His waste is minimal. What about the rest of the victims? You saw the size of those trunks. He has consumed perhaps a dozen people over 5 years based on the previous owner's disappearance and the others I've heard rumors about. Where are the large bones? The unusable parts?" Vance shook his head, thinking back to the waste pit and the smokehouse. The waste pit only had small vegetable scraps. The smokehouse was locked. "The smokehouse," Finch repeated, his eyes widening with grim realization. "The meat is cured or spiced for preservation and to mask the taste. Sheriff, he is not just serving the meat, he is using everything. Bones can be ground into fine powder and used as fertilizer or even thickening agents in his stews. Fat can be rendered for cooking. And the larger, unmistakable bones, the skulls, the pelvises, these cannot be easily destroyed or hidden." A new, more terrifying thought struck Vance. "The second trunk. I only opened one. He had two. One for the victims' possessions, to erase their financial trail. The other must contain the remains he couldn't destroy." The task was now clear. They needed a full team and a legal warrant based on Finch's evidence of unnatural material found on Croft's property. But they couldn't risk the time it would take to secure a definitive official warrant from a distant county judge. The immediate danger outweighed protocol. Vance rode out, this time calling on his most reliable men, Jeb, Guthrie, Ben, and 2 others, instructing them to arm themselves heavily. He still could not tell them the full truth, only that Croft was implicated in a series of violent disappearances and was considered extremely dangerous. They met at the edge of the dark woods, about half a mile from the inn. The night was moonless, heavy with the oppressive silence of the Georgian swampland. "Men," Vance spoke in a low, firm voice. "We are going in. We suspect Croft has multiple victims buried in the cellar. We need to secure the perimeter, and 2 of you will secure the kitchen door. He is not to be allowed near the back of the inn. I will head straight for the root cellar. We take him alive, if possible." The men nodded, grimly adjusting their rifles and pistols. The silence of the night was shattered only by the creaking of leather and the heavy thud of their boots as they advanced toward the single dim light of the Crossroads Inn. As they crept closer, a realization hit Vance. Croft had served supper just hours ago. The townspeople, the merchants, the travelers, they were all unsuspecting participants in his monstrous routine. The immediacy of the horror lent a desperate urgency to their movements. They reached the perimeter. Vance signaled, and Jeb and Ben moved silently to secure the main kitchen door, positioning themselves in the deep shadows. Vance, Guthrie, and the other men moved toward the root cellar hatch, their hearts pounding in the oppressive stillness. The smell of cooking spices, a faint, deceptive aroma, was still noticeable near the back wall. Vance knelt by the hatch, pulling his picklock, determined to force the lock quickly. But as his fingers touched the cold metal, he heard a sound from the stable area. A sharp, distinct whinny from a horse that sounded distressed, followed by a heavy thump. Croft was awake, and he wasn't in the inn. The distressed whinny of the horse and the heavy thump from the stables immediately derailed Vance's methodical plan. He stood up, signaling to his men to hold position. If Croft was in the stable, his access to the root cellar was momentarily cut off, but the element of surprise was lost. Vance drew his pistol. "Guthrie, cover me. The rest of you, maintain the perimeter. If he makes a run for the inn, stop him." Vance moved quickly and quietly toward the stables, the ground shifting softly under his weight. He approached the stable door, which was slightly ajar, a faint light glowing from inside. He could hear low, rhythmic sounds, a heavy object being dragged. He kicked the door open violently, his pistol raised. The stable was illuminated by a single caged lantern. Silas Croft stood in the center, dressed in dark trousers and a stained apron, not his usual immaculate linen. He was dragging the body of a young stable boy, one who often worked at the inn, toward the far wall. The boy's head was clearly damaged. Croft looked up, his movements pausing but his face remaining utterly composed, showing no surprise, only a cold disappointment. "Sheriff Vance," Croft stated, his voice quiet, almost mournful. "A messy business. The boy was overly curious. He saw me tending to a large piece of meat I keep in the carriage house. He became distressed. I had to quiet him." Vance aimed his pistol directly at Croft's chest. "Drop the boy and put your hands up, Croft. It's over." Croft let the boy's body slump to the floor, then slowly raised his hands, which were stained dark, almost black. "Over. Sheriff, it's never over. People always travel. People always hunger. And people always disappear." He looked around the stable. "You didn't come alone, I presume. You brought your friends to sample my hospitality. Where are the Eldridges, Croft? Where is Alistair? Where are any of my patrons, Sheriff?" Croft countered with a chilling calmness. "They are gone, or rather, they are utilized. Every part. The tragedy is waste, Vance. I merely abhor waste." Vance's mind was racing. He was alone with a cold-blooded killer who had just claimed another life. He had to keep Croft talking, waiting for the backup to position correctly. "The second trunk in the cellar. What is inside it, Croft?" Croft's thin smile returned. Quicker this time, laced with a genuine flicker of amusement. The relics. That is the true accounting, Sheriff. The first trunk holds their history. The second holds their immortality. The parts that remain, that cannot be readily digested or destroyed, the trophies of my efficiency." A shadow moved at the stable entrance behind Vance. Jeb, his deputy, was slowly creeping forward, rifle at the ready. Croft saw the slight flicker of movement reflected in the glass of a window pane near the stable entrance. He didn't react immediately, but his eyes narrowed. "You are a slow learner, Sheriff," Croft said, his tone suddenly shifting to a low, intense warning. "You should have come alone. You've put your men in danger." Before Vance could fully react, Croft made a sudden, lightning-fast move. He wasn't reaching for a weapon. He was reaching for a long, specialized butcher's cleaver hanging discreetly near a rack of horsetack. He snatched it, the large, polished steel blade glinting wickedly in the lamplight. Croft didn't charge Vance. Instead, he swung the cleaver high and with brutal force, aiming not at a person, but at the lantern hanging from the central beam. The lamp shattered with an explosive crash, showering the stable in sparks and immediately plunging the area into total darkness. "He's loose," Vance roared, dropping to a crouch, blinded by the sudden transition from light to black. A terrifying sound followed, the metallic scrape of the cleaver dragging against the stone floor, moving rapidly. Croft wasn't a brawler. He was a silent, calculating predator, using the darkness and his knowledge of the confined space. Vance heard a choked gasp and the heavy thud of a body. "Jeb!" Vance shouted, firing 2 shots blindly in the direction of the scraping sound. The bullets tore into the wooden wall. Vance pulled a small shielded oil lamp from his coat pocket and quickly lit it, the dim yellow glow struggling against the darkness. Jeb lay motionless by the entrance, a dark, heavy injury visible on his head. Croft was gone. Vance moved to the stable door. "He's out. He's heading for the inn." Vance burst out of the stables, followed by Guthrie and the others who had heard the shots. They saw a brief, fleeting shadow disappearing around the corner of the inn toward the kitchen entrance. "He's going for the cellar," Vance yelled. "Don't let him destroy the evidence. Guthrie, take the back. Ben, with me, the front." The men split up, running full tilt. Vance and Ben rushed to the kitchen entrance, finding the door still barricaded, but they could hear muffled sounds from inside, the violent splintering of wood. Croft was trying to break out the back window or door. Guthrie screamed, a sharp, terrible sound that was quickly cut short. Vance knew. Croft had engaged Guthrie. He pivoted and ran back toward the corner, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The hunter was now the hunted, and the butcher was using his own killing grounds as his advantage. Vance rounded the corner of the inn and stopped abruptly, the small oil lamp casting dancing shadows. Guthrie lay on the ground, wounded but moving, clutching his leg. Silas Croft stood over him, the cleaver raised for a final heavy blow. Vance didn't hesitate. Croft. The killer turned slowly, his eyes reflecting the small light, completely devoid of fear or remorse. He looked at Vance with a measure of contempt. "You should have left this business to the experts, Sheriff. You have no stomach for the hard truth," Croft said, his voice a quiet snarl. Croft lunged, not at Guthrie but directly at Vance, closing the distance with terrifying speed. Vance fired, the shot echoing explosively in the night. The bullet struck Croft in the shoulder, spinning him violently. The cleaver flew from his hand, skittering across the gravel and coming to rest near the kitchen door. Croft stumbled, clutching his shoulder, a dark stain immediately spreading across his shirt, but he did not fall. The wound only seemed to fuel a manic, terrifying resolve. He turned and bolted, not toward the stables, but straight for the kitchen door, crashing through the barricade Ben had set up. "He's in the kitchen. Secure the exit," Vance ordered, running forward to check on Guthrie. Guthrie waved him off, pain etched on his face. "Go, Sheriff. He's heading for the cellar hatch inside the kitchen." Vance kicked the kitchen door open and stepped into a world of heat, steam, and intense, cloying aromas. The kitchen was massive, the heart of the Crossroads Inn, dominated by a huge stone hearth and cast-iron stoves. Knives, pots, and spices hung from the rafters. The air was heavy with the smell of rendered fat and simmering meat, the same traveler's comfort stew from the night before, still warm in a huge pot over the low fire. Silas Croft was already at the root cellar hatch, which Vance realized was also accessible from a corner of the kitchen floor, usually covered by a heavy cutting block. He was desperately trying to lift the block with his good arm. "Stop, Croft. The evidence is already secure. You're caught," Vance yelled, aiming his pistol. Croft ignored him. With a grunt of effort, he shoved the heavy block aside, revealing the inner hatch, which was secured with a different, smaller bolt. He fumbled with the bolt. Vance took a careful, measured shot. The bullet hit the wall next to Croft's head, sending splinters flying. It was a clear warning. Croft let out a guttural scream of frustration and abandoned the hatch. He snatched a long, razor-sharp carving knife from a nearby rack and turned on Vance, his eyes blazing with a feral, cornered rage. "You won't take my collection, Vance. You won't spoil the truth of my creation," Croft charged. Vance could not afford to risk another shot that might miss and hit the volatile kerosene lamps or the heavy stores of grain. He sidestepped the charge, shoving a heavy bag of flour off a shelf. The sack burst, filling the kitchen with a blinding white cloud. Vance used the momentary distraction. He tackled Croft, sending them both crashing into a stack of dry firewood. The two men struggled fiercely in the tight space. Croft, though wounded, fought with the desperate strength of a maniac, trying to plunge the carving knife into Vance's side. Vance managed to lock Croft's wounded arm against the wall, but the killer was using his weight to bear down, the knife hand still free. Vance could feel the terrifying heat of the killer's breath on his face. "They deserved it, Vance. Weak, traveling, unaccounted for. They became substance," Croft hissed, pushing the knife closer to Vance's chest. Vance found the strength born of pure adrenaline and terror. He headbutted Croft violently. The blow stunned the killer for a second. Vance seized the opportunity, twisting Croft's wrist sharply. The knife dropped with a clatter onto the stone floor. Before Croft could recover, Vance shoved him hard toward the hearth. Croft stumbled backward and fell, his head striking the heavy iron edge of the hearth. The impact was sickeningly loud and final. Croft lay still, his gaze fixed blankly on the ceiling, the light of the fire illuminating the dark blood that was already spreading around his head and shoulder. Vance stood over him, breathing heavily, the smell of flour, blood, and the omnipresent stew thick in his nostrils. Ben and the other men burst in, rifles ready. They looked at the scene, the overturned kitchen, the scattered flour, and the motionless body of the innkeeper. "It's done," Vance gasped, holstering his pistol. "Secure him. And Ben, open the cellar. We need to see what's in that second trunk." The men secured the limp body of Croft, tying his hands tightly. Vance, still shaking, walked to the cellar hatch, lifted the block, and opened the inner bolt. He descended the stairs, followed by Ben, whose lantern cast a wavering light over the familiar shelves of pickles and salted hams. The first trunk remained a macabre closet of clothes and papers. Vance went to the second, its iron clamps still holding the secret. "This is it, Ben. The trophies. Prepare yourself." With a final terrible act of will, Vance forced the padlocks open and threw back the heavy lid of the second trunk. The interior of the second trunk was lined with a thick, coarse wool blanket. Vance hesitated for a moment, the stench rising from the container, a mix of dry earth, preservation spices, and a deep, unsettling mustiness, was worse than anything he had encountered. Ben held the lantern high, his face pale with dread. Vance reached in and pulled back the blanket. The trunk was filled, not with entire skeletons, which would have been impossible for Croft to hide, but with a horrifying, meticulously organized collection of bones. They were all small, dense and bleached white, carefully separated by size and type, suggesting they had been cleaned thoroughly. But among the smaller bones, the phalanges, the ribs, and the shattered pieces that were likely ground down for thickening agents were the unmistakable heavier pieces. 7 human skulls, polished and completely clean, stacked neatly and unnervingly in one corner, each one with a distinct clean cut at the base, indicating how they had been removed from the body. A selection of jaw bones and pelvic fragments, labeled with small hand-painted wooden tags, likely referencing Croft's inventory journal. 2 femurs, one much larger than the other, which Vance realized must belong to the Eldridges, given the dates in the journal. Croft's trophies were a macabre, curated museum of his victims. The skull of Alistair, the previous owner, was likely among them. The cold, scientific precision of the arrangement was perhaps more chilling than finding a mass grave. It spoke of a killer who did not simply dispatch victims, but who truly believed he was engaged in an elevated, necessary process, a kind of perverse, ultimate utilization. Vance stepped back, his head reeling. "Get Finch out here immediately," he choked out, his voice hoarse. "He needs to identify these. This is the truth." They secured the trunks and then returned to the kitchen. The other men had securely tied Croft, who was now beginning to stir, groaning faintly, his eyes fluttering. He was alive, though heavily wounded. Vance looked at the massive pot of traveler's comfort stew simmering on the hearth. It was the centerpiece of the Crossroads Inn's horror. He walked over and plunged a ladle into the thick, dark liquid, pulling out a chunk of the special cut of meat. It was firm, marbled, and disturbingly familiar in its shape. He dropped the ladle back into the pot with a clatter. "We need to catalog everything. This kitchen, the cellar, the stable. Every single knife, every spice, every remnant of food. The town will need to know, but first, we need the irrefutable evidence for the court." The entire operation lasted until dawn. Dr. Finch arrived, his composure shaken by the sight of the cellar and the surgical precision of the collection. Croft was loaded onto a wagon for transfer to the county jail, his stillness only occasionally broken by a low, defeated moan. As the sun rose over the silent town of Waycross, casting a sickly yellow light on the Crossroads Inn, Vance stood on the porch, watching the last of the forensic work being done. The horror of the situation was settling in, the scale of the deception, the years of silent murder, the unsuspecting consumption by the town's most respectable citizens. He saw Eliza, the young serving girl, standing a distance away, wrapped in a blanket, tears streaming down her face. She had been working in the inn for over a year, serving the man who used people as ingredients. Vance walked over to her. "Eliza, you were brave. Your words were the start of this. You saved many lives." She shook her head, unable to speak, only pointing a trembling finger toward the rising sun. The travelers, Sheriff, all those travelers, they came and they ate, and they never left. The full weight of Croft's operation, a systematic, cold-blooded machine fueled by human tragedy and refined by culinary skill, was now public. The Crossroads Inn was no longer a rest stop. It was a memorial to the terrifying reality that the worst monsters are the ones that smile politely and offer you a meal. The resolution of the initial mystery brought only a new collective trauma. The town was safe from the butcher, but the psychological wounds were just beginning to bleed. The truth had been revealed, and it was far darker than anyone had imagined. The butcher is caught, and the secret of the Crossroads Inn is out. But the full story of Silas Croft, his methods, his mind, and the investigation that brought him down, is far from over. If you found the courage to stick with the terror this far, help us share the warning. Subscribe to the channel now and hit the notification bell for the final chilling chapters. The capture of Silas Croft sent shockwaves far beyond Waycross. The news of the cannibalistic butcher of the Crossroads Inn was a gruesome headline across the state of Georgia and the entire American South. The case was unprecedented in its calculated, cold-blooded efficiency. Sheriff Vance became an overnight figure of grim local fame, haunted by the evidence he'd uncovered. The town of Waycross, however, was paralyzed by shame, sickness, and self-doubt. The fear wasn't about the future butcher, but the past meal. The trial was set in Savannah, the largest city, to minimize local bias and manage the intense public outcry. Dr. Finch's testimony, based on the myoglobin findings and the analysis of the stew remnants, which indeed contained human proteins and fats, was the scientific cornerstone of the prosecution. Vance's testimony detailing the contents of the trunks, the financial ledgers, the victim's clothes, and the 7 polished skulls provided the chilling proof of the methodology. Croft, heavily guarded and still nursing his wounds, remained unnervingly calm throughout the proceedings. He dismissed the defense lawyer appointed to him and chose to address the court himself. "I am not mad, gentlemen," he stated in his even, controlled voice addressing the jury. "I am merely efficient. The world is full of weak, isolated people who pass through life unnoticed. I gave them purpose. I made them useful. Their lives were fleeting. Their essence, their substance became the sustenance of others. This is the ultimate preservation, a higher form of service." His chilling lack of remorse and his philosophy only intensified the public's hatred. Vance watched him, noting the same flat grey eyes that had unsettled him from the first moment. The man was not insane in the typical sense. He was driven by a cold, meticulous logic that inverted all human morality. During the trial, the prosecution focused on the psychological horror, the manipulation, the meticulous planning, and the sheer audacity of serving the victims to their peers. They presented the journal, with its detached yield and marbling entries, as the ultimate proof of a calculated, prolonged evil. The defense's only angle was to question the chain of evidence, the unauthorized search of the root cellar before a warrant was issued. However, the discovery of the injured deputy and the attempted escape solidified the necessity of Vance's actions. The jury saw the immediacy of the threat. The psychological terror of the case led to widespread distrust and fear. People across Georgia stopped eating at isolated inns. The simple act of breaking bread became an act of profound vulnerability. Vance worked tirelessly, using the town's resources to identify the owners of the skulls and documents, linking Croft to at least 10 disappearances spanning 5 years. One afternoon, Vance received an unexpected visitor at his small temporary office in Savannah, Mr. Frederick Hayes, a respected Savannah lawyer who had followed the case closely. Hayes laid a large, folded map on Vance's desk, a detailed survey map of the Crossroads Inn property. "Sheriff Vance," Hayes said, leaning in conspiratorially, "Croft is a man of detail, we know this. He kept the skulls, the clothes, the documents. He used the kitchen waste as fertilizer, and the stew remnants were consumed. But there is a gap in his logic, one thing he did not account for." Vance frowned. "What is it?" "The blood," Hayes whispered. "When you butcher any large animal, or a person as the case may be, there is a tremendous volume of blood. He couldn't have simply poured it down the drain. It would have clogged the pipes and smelled foul. He certainly didn't cook with it all. What did he do with the massive volume of waste blood from 10 or more victims? Vance felt a sickening lurch in his gut. Croft was meticulous. He abhorred waste. The soil, Vance murmured, looking at the map. He had to dispose of it somewhere quiet, somewhere that would absorb it. Hayes pointed to a patch on the map, far from the root cellar, the waste pit, and the stables. It was a large, densely wooded area at the very edge of Croft's expansive property, near a small, slow-moving creek that emptied into the surrounding swamp. This area, Sheriff, it's marked in an old survey as a manure and blood pit for the inn's occasional livestock. But Croft claimed to buy all his meat from an exclusive local source. Why maintain a pit for blood? The idea provided a final, terrifying clue to Croft's complete process. He didn't just utilize the flesh and bones. He had a specific, isolated place for the final, gruesome effluent, one last piece of evidence. Vance knew he had to confirm it. The psychological impact of finding this final site would be the last, definitive hammer blow to Croft's defense and his chilling philosophy. Vance drove a small borrowed wagon back to Waycross, carrying Dr. Finch and 3 silent, grim-faced laborers. They parked far from the Crossroads Inn, which was now boarded up and guarded, a cold monument to terror. They hiked into the dense, swampy woods at the rear of the property following Hayes's map. The air was heavy, damp, and still, smelling of musk and decaying vegetation. The silence of the swamp was oppressive. Finally, they reached the spot marked on the map. A small, almost hidden clearing surrounded by thick-trunked cypress trees. In the center was a depression in the earth, roughly 10 feet square, overgrown with thick, blackish-green moss and a strange, unnaturally dark, dense vegetation. "The blood pit," Finch whispered, staring at the unnatural color of the ground. Vance instructed the laborers to begin digging, working slowly and methodically. They dug only a few feet before the earth changed dramatically. The regular reddish-brown Georgian soil gave way to a slick, black, heavy clay that glistened with an unnerving, almost metallic sheen. Then the smell hit them. Not the smell of normal swamp decay, but a deep, overwhelming stench of iron, decay, and putrefaction. The unmistakable, powerful odor of massive volumes of coagulated blood mixed with rich, organic matter. Finch knelt, taking a soil sample and examining the vegetation. "The nitrogen content here is enormous, Vance, unnaturally high. The plants are thriving on a sickeningly rich medium. He was pouring the raw effluent, the blood and other liquid waste, here for years. As they dug deeper, they didn't find bones or flesh, but the heavy, congealed black clay, soaked and preserved by the very material it absorbed. It was the final, unutilized component of Croft's process, the proof of the sheer scale of his operation. This wasn't a burial site, it was a waste facility, confirming that Croft treated his victims not as bodies, but as raw material. He was correct in his own twisted way, Vance said, staring into the dark pit. He didn't waste anything. Even the blood became the sustenance for the land around his inn, creating an unnatural bounty. They continued digging until they uncovered something metallic near the edge of the pit. A heavy, iron-banded pump mechanism, partially buried. The pump would have allowed Croft to easily transfer the liquid waste from the kitchen through an underground pipe system directly to this isolated pit, avoiding suspicion and mess. It was the final, horrifying piece of his infrastructure of murder. The discovery was documented thoroughly, the soil samples collected, and the pump dismantled. The evidence was irrefutable. Silas Croft had built an entire self-contained system to facilitate his cannibalistic venture, from the procurement of his ingredients to the disposal of the final effluent. Vance felt a profound sense of closure, but no relief. The horror was complete. They returned to Savannah with the final physical evidence that closed all loopholes in the prosecution's case. The final days of the trial were anticlimactic. Presented with the evidence from the blood pit and the pumping mechanism, Croft's defense collapsed entirely. His elaborate justification of efficiency was revealed to be nothing more than the monstrous self-deception of a cold-blooded killer. The jury returned the verdict in under an hour. Guilty on all counts of murder, and the judge, using the full authority of the 1857 Georgia Legal Code, sentenced Silas Croft to death by hanging. Croft received the sentence with his trademark indifference, a slight, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips, as if the condemnation of society only reinforced his unique, terrible position outside of it. He had created his own horrifying truth, and he would take it with him. The terror was over, but the psychological scars on the community and on Sheriff Vance were permanent. Vance had faced the absolute darkness of human nature, a darkness that was grounded not in phantoms, but in a horrific, cold logic. The task of restoring peace to the devastated town remained. The execution of Silas Croft took place a few weeks later in Savannah. Sheriff Vance did not attend, seeing no need to witness the final act. His justice had been served with the closing of the root cellar and the filling of the blood pit. The Crossroads Inn was the final challenge. No one in Waycross would touch the land or the building. It was legally seized by the state, but the structure remained a symbol of profound psychological trauma. The smell of the inn, even when cleaned and aired, lingered in the town's collective memory, forever associated with the rich, deceptive aroma of the traveler's comfort. Vance oversaw the final methodical dismantling of the inn. He ensured every plank, every stone of the kitchen, and every piece of the cellar was removed and burned. He personally stood guard as the foundation was ripped up and the hole was filled with clean lime and fresh earth. The final step was the planting of a grove of young pine trees over the site. The town of Waycross slowly began its recovery. People avoided the old post road. They spoke in hushed tones about the Eldridges and the other victims, now properly identified and mourned. The trauma of the cannibalism led to a period of intense religious reflection and social solidarity, a desperate attempt to reaffirm humanity in the face of such calculated inhumanity. Sheriff Vance resigned a year later. The continuous corrosive exposure to the pure, cold evil of Silas Croft had worn him down. He had saved the town, but the knowledge of what lay beneath the ordinary surface of life, the chilling reality that a monster could operate for years in plain sight, offering his victims as a feast, was a burden too heavy to bear. He sold his small property and moved west, away from the humidity and the dark, rich soil of Georgia, seeking a quieter life where the concept of local exclusive source would be nothing more than a simple culinary term. Years later, the site of the Crossroads Inn was just a silent, peaceful pine grove. The small depression in the swamp, the former blood pit, was covered by thick, lush growth, only a faint, metallic trace in the swamp water remaining as a subtle, silent marker of the horror. The ultimate terror of the disturbing case of the killer who served guests the flesh of their own victims was not the brutality of the act, but its absolute realism and planning. There was no curse, no ghost, no ancient ritual, only the cold, logical mechanism of a single man who saw human life as a resource to be efficiently consumed. The story of Silas Croft became a whispered legend on the trading routes, a constant chilling reminder that the deepest darkness often resides in the quietest places, served up with a thin, polite smile and an unforgettable flavor. And sometimes the scariest thing is simply realizing that the most monstrous act can be the most meticulously planned.